The wind carried dust and sorrow across the plains as Grace Zimmerman knelt beside her fallen companion, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face, her trembling fingers stroking the once glossy mane of her beloved horse. Shadow had been with her through everything: the escape from Boston, the treacherous journey west, and the building of her modest homestead outside Wheatland, Wyoming. Now he lay motionless, the victim of a rattlesnake's deadly strike, leaving Grace utterly alone in this unforgiving territory. "Please don't leave me," she whispered, though she knew it was too late. The poison had worked quickly, and Shadow's once vibrant eyes had clouded over with the finality of death. Grace had watched helplessly as her companion of 5 years had stumbled, collapsed, and breathed his last beneath the merciless summer sun. The sound of approaching hoofbeats barely registered through her grief. She didn't bother to look up, even when the rider dismounted and approached with cautious steps. Only when a shadow fell across Shadow's still form did she raise her tear-stained face. Before her stood a tall man with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes the color of the Wyoming sky. His worn leather vest and dusty boots marked him as one who lived by the rhythms of the land. What struck Grace most, however, was not his appearance but the gentleness in his expression as he surveyed the scene before him. "Madam," he said softly, removing his hat in respect, "I'm Frank Thornton. I own the Double T Ranch a few miles west. I was riding fence when I saw you from the ridge." He knelt down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "I'm mighty sorry about your horse." Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Shadow was all I had left in this world, Mr. Thornton." Her voice broke on the words. 5 years together, and now I don't know what I'll do." Frank nodded silently, his eyes taking in the modest cabin 100 yards away, the small garden patch struggling against the Wyoming elements, and the lone woman before him who clearly had no one else to turn to. He made his decision in that moment, standing and walking to his own horse, a beautiful chestnut mare with intelligent eyes and a white blaze down her face. "This is Penny," he said, stroking the mare's neck. "Best horse I've ever had. Sure-footed, calm in a storm, and smart as they come." Grace looked up in confusion. "She's beautiful." Without hesitation, Frank walked Penny forward and extended the reins toward Grace. "She's yours now." Grace stared at him in disbelief. "What?" "No, I couldn't possibly. You need her more than I do," he said simply, as if he weren't offering his most valuable possession to a complete stranger. "I've got other horses at the ranch. A person can't survive out here alone without a good mount. Take her." "But why would you do this for someone you don't even know?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank shrugged, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. "Because out here we look after each other. It's the only way any of us survive." He pressed the reins into her hand. "I'll help you bury your horse, and then I'll walk back to my ranch. It's not far." Grace's fingers closed around the leather reins, feeling the warmth of them, the lifeline they represented. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't need to," Frank said, already moving to retrieve a shovel from her cabin. "But I wouldn't say no to a cup of coffee before I head back if you're offering." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Grace found herself sitting across from Frank Thornton at her small kitchen table. The coffee was strong and bitter, but he didn't seem to mind, drinking it gratefully as they sat in companionable silence. "How long have you been out here alone?" he finally asked. Grace stared into her cup. 2 years. I came west with my husband, Thomas. He died of fever the first winter." She didn't elaborate on the struggle it had been to survive after Thomas's death, how she'd nearly given up until Shadow had nudged her awake one morning, demanding care when she could barely care for herself. Frank nodded slowly. "It's a hard country. Harder still for a woman alone. He set his cup down. "Do you have family back east?" "None who would claim me," Grace said bitterly. "I married against my father's wishes. He made it clear there was no place for me in Boston if I chose Thomas." Her fingers traced the edge of the table. "I don't regret it, though. Thomas loved this land, said it was the last place a person could be truly free." "Your husband was right about that," Frank agreed. "Though freedom comes with its price out here." Grace nodded, thinking of all she had lost. "That it does, Mr. Thornton." "Frank," he corrected gently. "If you're going to be taking care of my best mare, I reckon we should be on a first-name basis." For the first time since he'd arrived, a small smile tugged at the corners of Grace's mouth. "Then I'm Grace." Frank finished his coffee and stood. "Well, Grace, I should head back before it gets dark. I meant what I said about Penny. She's yours now." "I still don't understand why," Grace said, following him to the door. Frank paused, his hat in his hands. "My pa used to say that a true measure of a man isn't what he has, but what he's willing to give when there's nothing in it for him." His eyes met hers. "Besides, Penny deserves someone who'll love her like you loved Shadow. I can see you've got a good heart." Before Grace could respond, he placed his hat on his head and stepped out into the fading light. She watched from her doorway as he walked away, his tall figure silhouetted against the golden glow of sunset. "Thank you," she called after him. Frank turned and tipped his hat. "I'll check in on you both in a few days, if that's all right." Grace nodded, surprised to find herself looking forward to it. As she watched him disappear into the gathering dusk, she felt Penny nudge her shoulder gently, as if introducing herself properly. Grace stroked the mare's velvet nose, a fresh wave of tears threatening not entirely of grief this time. "Well, Penny," she whispered, "it seems we've both found ourselves a friend today." True to his word, Frank returned 3 days later. Grace spotted him approaching from the west, riding a dappled gray gelding. She had spent the intervening days getting to know Penny, marveling at the mare's gentle disposition and quick intelligence. Already, a bond was forming between them, though Grace still mourned Shadow and visited his grave each morning. When Frank dismounted in her yard, Grace was ready with fresh coffee and the corn bread she'd baked that morning. "How are you ladies getting along?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "She's remarkable," Grace admitted. "Patient with me, even when I'm clumsy with the saddle." Frank nodded appreciatively. "She's always been good that way, never met a horse with a better temperament." He accepted the coffee Grace offered. "And how are you holding up?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern, nearly undid her. "I'm managing," she said, the words catching slightly. "It helps to have Penny. I'm not sure what would have happened if you hadn't come along when you did." Frank's expression darkened. "This country's no place to be without transportation. Too many things can go wrong too quickly." He sipped his coffee. "Which is why I came by today. I wanted to ask if you'd consider moving your operation to the Double T." Grace stared at him, stunned. "Moving to your ranch? But why?" "I've got a small cabin that's sitting empty, used to be the foreman's place before he got married and moved into town. It's not much, but it's solid. And I could use the help." He seemed almost embarrassed. "Truth is, I've been looking for someone to help with the cooking and such. My housekeeper, Esther, is getting on in years and could use an extra pair of hands." Pride flared in Grace's chest. "I'm not looking for charity, Mr. Thornton." "Frank," he reminded her, "and it's not charity, it's a job offer, fair wages for honest work." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "Plus, you'd have people around. Winters get mighty lonely out here by yourself." Grace considered his words. The prospect of another winter alone in her tiny cabin was indeed daunting. Last year, she'd gone nearly 6 weeks without speaking to another soul when the snow had cut off the trail to town. I'd still have my independence, she asked cautiously. Frank nodded. Your own cabin, your own garden if you want it, but yes, you'd have people nearby if trouble came. He hesitated. And you'd have me. Something in the way he said those last words made Grace's heart beat a little faster. She'd been so focused on survival that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone care about her welfare. I'll think about it, she said finally. Frank smiled, seeming pleased with even this non-committal response. That's all I ask. He finished his coffee and stood. That's fine corn bread, by the way, best I've had since my mother's. Grace felt an unexpected flush of pleasure at the compliment. Thank you. As Frank prepared to leave, he hesitated. There's a social at the church in Wheatland this Saturday. Whole community turns out. If you're interested, I could stop by and escort you. He rushed on before she could answer. No obligation about the job or anything else. Just thought you might enjoy the company. Grace hadn't been to town for anything but supplies in months. The idea of music, conversation, and community was suddenly appealing. I'd like that, she said, surprising herself. Frank's smile brightened his entire face. I'll be by around 4 then. He mounted his gray gelding with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. Take care, Grace. As she watched him ride away, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. The crushing weight of loneliness that had become her constant companion seemed just a little lighter. She turned to Penny, who was grazing contentedly nearby. What do you think, girl? Should we give your former owner a chance? Penny lifted her head and nickered softly, as if in agreement. Saturday arrived with crystal-clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. Grace spent the morning cleaning her modest cabin, more out of nervousness than necessity. In the afternoon, she bathed using precious water heated on the stove and dressed in her one good dress, a simple blue cotton that Thomas had bought her for their last Christmas together. As she pinned up her hair, Grace caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. For the first time in months, there was color in her cheeks and a brightness in her eyes that had nothing to do with unshed tears. This is just a social gathering, she told herself firmly. Nothing more. Yet when 4 o'clock approached and she saw Frank riding toward her cabin, her heart quickened in a way that suggested her feelings might be more complicated than she was ready to admit. Frank had clearly made an effort for the occasion. His usually dusty clothes had been replaced by clean trousers, a pressed shirt, and a vest that emphasized his broad shoulders. He'd trimmed his beard and slicked back his sandy hair. When he removed his hat upon dismounting, Grace noticed he'd even cut his hair. You look lovely, he said, his admiration evident in his eyes. Grace smoothed her dress self-consciously. Thank you. You clean up rather well yourself. Frank's laugh was warm and genuine. Esther would be pleased to hear that. She's been after me for years to present myself properly in public. He offered his arm. Shall we? They rode into Wheatland together, Grace on Penny and Frank on his gray gelding, whom he introduced as Thunder. The small town was bustling with activity as they approached, with wagons and riders converging on the white steepled church at its center. Biggest social of the summer, Frank explained as they tied their horses to the hitching post. Harvest is still a ways off, but not so close that folks are too busy to enjoy themselves. Grace nodded, suddenly nervous at the prospect of so many people. It had been so long since she'd engaged in social niceties. What if she'd forgotten how? As if sensing her apprehension, Frank placed a reassuring hand on her elbow. Everyone's friendly, he promised, and if it gets to be too much, just say the word and we'll make our excuses. His consideration warmed her. Thank you. Inside the church, The pews had been pushed aside to create an open space where couples were already dancing to the lively music provided by a fiddle, banjo, and accordion. Tables laden with food lined one wall, while children darted between the adults, playing impromptu games of tag. Frank Thornton, as I live and breathe. A plump woman with gray streaked hair approached them. I was beginning to think you'd sworn off civilization entirely. Frank grinned. Mrs. Patterson, may I present Miss Grace Zimmerman? Grace, this is Ida Patterson, who knows everything about everyone in 3 counties. Mrs. Patterson swatted Frank's arm good-naturedly before extending her hand to Grace. Don't you listen to him. I just take an interest in my neighbor's welfare. Her kind eyes assessed Grace. You're the widow with the homestead north of the creek, aren't you? We've all been worried about you out there alone. Before Grace could respond, they were surrounded by curious townsfolk, all eager to meet the woman who had somehow drawn the reclusive Frank Thornton into town. Grace was introduced to so many people that their names became a blur, though everyone was welcoming. Frank hasn't escorted a lady to a social in years, whispered a young woman named Lucy as they sampled the refreshments. Half the eligible women in the county have tried to catch his eye. Grace glanced across the room where Frank was engaged in conversation with several men. We're just neighbors, she said quickly. He's been kind enough to help me through a difficult time. Lucy's knowing smile suggested she didn't entirely believe this explanation, but she tactfully changed the subject. As the evening progressed, Grace found herself enjoying the company and conversation more than she had anticipated. When Frank finally claimed her for a dance, the touch of his hand at her waist sent a flutter through her that both alarmed and excited her. You seem to be having a good time, he observed as they moved around the floor. Grace nodded. I'd forgotten what it was like to be among people. To laugh and talk about ordinary things. Life can't be all work and struggle, Frank said softly. We need moments like these to remind us why we endure the hard times. His words resonated with something deep inside her. My husband used to say something similar. Frank's expression grew thoughtful. He sounds like he was a wise man. He was, Grace agreed, but he was also stubborn and sometimes reckless. She smiled at the memory. Thomas wanted everything at once, the land, the cattle, the success. He wouldn't listen when people told him to start small and build slowly. And you, Grace considered the question. I wanted what he wanted because I loved him, but I would have been content with less, I think, as long as we were together. Frank nodded, understanding. There's wisdom in that, too. As the music ended, he kept hold of her hand a moment longer than necessary. Have you given any more thought to my offer? About coming to work at the Double T? The question brought Grace back to reality. Despite the pleasant evening, she still had decisions to make about her future. I have, she admitted, but I'm not sure I'm ready to give up my independence. I respect that, Frank said, but the offer remains open, no time limit. The ride back to her cabin was peaceful, the Wyoming night sky ablaze with stars. When they reached her door, Frank dismounted to help her down, his strong hands circling her waist. For a moment after her feet touched the ground, they stood close enough that Grace could feel the warmth radiating from him. Thank you for a wonderful evening, she said, stepping back slightly. Frank smiled, the moonlight casting shadows across his features. The pleasure was mine, Grace. He hesitated. Would it be all right if I called on you again? The question hung between them, weighted with possibilities neither was quite ready to name. I'd like that, Grace answered truthfully. Frank nodded, clearly pleased. Good night, then. Good night, Frank. As she watched him ride away, Grace felt a curious mixture of emotions, gratitude for his kindness, certainly, but also a stirring of something she had thought died with Thomas, a tentative, fragile hope that perhaps her heart wasn't as permanently broken as she had believed. Inside her cabin, she lit a lamp and sat at her small table, thinking about Frank's offer. The double T would provide security, company, and purpose, all things she desperately needed. Yet the thought of abandoning the homestead she and Thomas had built together felt like a betrayal of his memory. "What would you have me do, Thomas?" she whispered into the stillness. No answer came, of course, but as Grace prepared for bed, she couldn't help but remember how Thomas had always urged her to be practical above all else. "The land doesn't care about sentiment, Gracie," he'd often said. "It only respects those who adapt." Perhaps it was time for her to adapt once more. The next morning dawned clear and hot, promising another scorching August day. Grace was up with the sun, tending to her small garden and feeding the chickens that provided her with eggs. Penny whinnied a greeting from the corral, and Grace spent a few minutes grooming the mare, marveling again at Frank's generosity. "He's a good man," she told Penny, working the brush through the mare's chestnut coat. "Not many would do what he did." As if summoned by her thoughts, the sound of approaching riders drew Grace's attention. Shielding her eyes against the morning sun, she was surprised to see not just Frank but 3 other men riding toward her cabin. Something about their formation and the purposeful way they rode sent a chill down her spine despite the heat. Frank's face was grim as he dismounted, followed by a man wearing a sheriff's badge. "Grace," he said without preamble, "this is Sheriff Miller from Wheatland. There's been trouble." Grace's hand went to her throat. "What kind of trouble?" Sheriff Miller stepped forward, his weathered face solemn beneath his hat. "Madam, we've had reports of cattle rustling in the area. 3 ranches hit in the past month. The Rawlins gang is suspected." "What does this have to do with me?" Grace asked, confusion evident in her voice. The sheriff exchanged glances with Frank before continuing. "The gang was spotted near your property yesterday. We believe they may be using the abandoned mines in the foothills as a hideout." Frank moved closer to Grace, his expression concerned. "They're dangerous men, Grace, and they're too close to your homestead for comfort." "Are you saying I'm in danger?" Grace asked, trying to process this unexpected development. Sheriff Miller nodded gravely. "I'm afraid so, madam. The Rawlins gang doesn't leave witnesses. If they think you might have seen something or could identify them." "But I haven't seen anything," Grace protested. "They don't know that," Frank said softly, "and they're not likely to take chances." The third man, whom Grace recognized as Dan Cooper, owner of the largest ranch in the county, spoke up. "We're forming a posse to go after them, but it'll take time. Meanwhile, you can't stay here alone." Grace straightened her spine. "This is my home. I'm not abandoning it." Frank stepped forward, his blue eyes intense. "No one's asking you to abandon it, Grace, but you need to be somewhere safe until this is resolved." "The double T," she said, realizing where this was heading. Frank nodded. "The offer I made before still stands, but now it's more urgent. I have men, guns, and a defensible position. The Rawlins gang would think twice before trying anything there." Grace looked from face to face, seeing the gravity of the situation reflected in each man's expression. She thought of her isolated cabin, miles from any neighbor, with only her rifle for protection. If armed men came in the night, "How long?" she asked finally. "Hard to say," Sheriff Miller answered honestly. "Could be days, could be weeks. These men know the territory and how to disappear when they need to." Grace took a deep breath, making her decision. "I'll need to gather my things and make arrangements for my chickens." "We'll help," Frank said immediately. "And I've got a wagon waiting in town we can send for. We'll take everything you need." As the men helped Grace secure her cabin and pack her belongings, she fought against the feeling that she was being forced from her home. This wasn't abandonment, she told herself firmly. It was a tactical retreat. She would return when it was safe. Within hours, Grace found herself traveling toward the Double T, seated beside Frank in a wagon loaded with her most precious possessions. Penny was tied to the back, along with a crate containing her 4 chickens. The sheriff and his deputy had ridden ahead to organize the posse, while Cooper had returned to his own ranch to warn his hands. "I'm sorry it had to happen this way," Frank said as they crested a hill that gave them a view of the sprawling Double T ranch below. "But I'd never forgive myself if something happened to you when I could have prevented it." Grace nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. The Double T was larger than she had imagined, a main house built of sturdy logs, several outbuildings, a large barn, corrals, and bunkhouses. In the distance, she could see cattle grazing on the lush summer grass. "It's not what you're used to," Frank said, mistaking her silence for disappointment. "But the foreman's cabin is private and you'll have your own space." "It's magnificent," Grace said honestly. "I just didn't realize the scale of your operation." Frank looked embarrassed. "It's grown over the years. Started with just me and 50 head of cattle 15 years ago." "You've built something remarkable," Grace said, genuine admiration in her voice. As they approached the ranch, several men emerged from the buildings to greet them. Frank made quick introductions: his foreman, Miguel, the cook, Hank, and several ranch hands whose names Grace knew she wouldn't remember immediately. "Miss Zimmerman will be staying in the foreman's cabin," Frank informed them. "She'll be helping Esther with the household duties." The men nodded respectfully, though Grace noticed curious glances exchanged among them. Clearly, Frank Thornton bringing a woman to the ranch was an unusual occurrence. An older woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun emerged from the main house, wiping her hands on her apron. "About time," she said, her sharp eyes taking in Grace and the wagon. "I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind, Mr. Thornton." "Esther, this is Miss Grace Zimmerman," Frank said, helping Grace down from the wagon. "Grace, this is Esther Campbell, who's kept this place running smoothly for longer than she'll admit." Esther snorted at this description but extended a work-roughened hand to Grace. "Welcome to the Double T, Miss Zimmerman. I hope you're as handy with a skillet as Mr. Thornton claims." Grace shook the older woman's hand firmly. "I manage well enough, Mrs. Campbell." "It's Miss," Esther corrected. "Never found a man worth the trouble, and you can call me Esther." Her stern expression softened slightly. "Now come along. You must be exhausted after all this excitement. I'll show you to your cabin while the men unload your things." The foreman's cabin was a short distance from the main house, close enough to be convenient but far enough to offer privacy. It was simple but well built, with 2 rooms, a main living area with a stove, table, and chairs, and a bedroom with a real bed frame and mattress. Luxuries compared to Grace's homestead. "It's not much," Esther said, watching Grace take in her new accommodations, "but it's clean and the roof doesn't leak." "It's perfect," Grace said sincerely. "Thank you." Esther nodded briskly. "Get settled in. Supper's at 6 in the main house. Mr. Thornton takes his meals with the hands, so you'll be expected there too." With that practical instruction, she left Grace alone. As she unpacked her few possessions, Grace tried to adjust to this sudden change in her circumstances. Just days ago, she had been mourning shadow and facing an uncertain future. Now she found herself in the midst of a cattle-rustling crisis, living on a prosperous ranch, and increasingly aware of her growing feelings for its owner. Life on the frontier, she reflected, rarely proceeded as planned. The key to survival was adapting to whatever challenges arose, something she was becoming quite practiced at. That evening, Grace joined the ranch household for supper in the large kitchen of the main house. The hands ate at a long table, while Frank sat at the head with Grace and Esther on either side of him. The conversation flowed easily, with tales of the day's work, good-natured ribbing between the men, and occasional questions directed at Grace about her homestead. After the meal, Frank walked Grace back to her cabin, the stars once again brilliant above them. "How are you settling in?" he asked. "Well enough," Grace replied. "Everyone has been very kind." "They're good people," Frank agreed. "Most have been with me for years." They reached her door, and Grace turned to face him. "Thank you, Frank, for everything. I know this isn't how either of us imagined things would progress." Frank's expression grew serious in the moonlight. "I meant what I said about keeping you safe, Grace. The Rawlins gang is not to be taken lightly." "I trust you," Grace said simply, and was rewarded with a smile that transformed his face. "That means more than you know." He took a step back, ever respectful. "Get some rest. Tomorrow Esther will show you the ropes around here." "Good night, Frank." "Good night, Grace." As she prepared for bed in her new surroundings, Grace couldn't help but reflect on how quickly her life had changed. The loss of Shadow had seemed like the end of her world, yet it had led to this new beginning. Perhaps, she thought as she drifted off to sleep, some endings were necessary for new chapters to begin. The next week passed in a whirlwind of activity as Grace learned the rhythms of life at the Double T. Each morning she rose at dawn to help Esther prepare breakfast for the hands. The days were filled with household tasks: baking, cleaning, mending, and tending the vegetable garden behind the main house. In the evenings, she joined the ranch family for supper, gradually learning each person's story and finding her place among them. Frank was often absent, riding with Sheriff Miller's posse as they searched for the Rawlins gang. When he was at the ranch, he made time to check on Grace, their conversations growing deeper and more personal with each passing day. One evening, about 10 days after Grace's arrival at the Double T, Frank invited her to walk with him after supper. They strolled toward a small rise overlooking the ranch, the setting sun painting the western sky in spectacular hues of orange and purple. "Sheriff Miller thinks the gang has moved on," Frank said as they watched the sunset. "No sign of them for days. They may have headed north into Montana territory." Grace felt a mixture of relief and unexpected disappointment. "So it would be safe for me to return to my homestead." Frank was quiet for a moment. "Yes, I suppose it would be." He turned to face her. "But I hope you'll consider staying." Grace studied his face in the fading light. "Because you need help with the cooking." "Because I've grown accustomed to seeing you every day," Frank admitted, his voice low. "Because the Double T feels more like a home with you here." The confession hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Grace felt her heart racing. "Frank," the sound of a rider approaching at speed interrupted whatever she might have said. They both turned to see Miguel galloping toward them, his expression urgent. "Boss," he called as he reined his horse to a stop. "Riders coming. Looks like the Rawlins gang, and they're heading straight for us." Frank's expression hardened instantly. "How many?" "At least 8, maybe more," Miguel reported grimly. "Johnny spotted them from the North Ridge." Frank turned to Grace, his eyes intense. "Get to the main house. Stay with Esther." He was already moving toward the ranch buildings, shouting orders to the hands who had emerged at the commotion. Grace hurried to the house, her heart pounding. Through the windows, she could see the men taking defensive positions, rifles ready. Esther was calmly loading a shotgun when Grace entered the kitchen. "Take this," the older woman said, handing Grace a revolver, "and stay away from the windows." The minutes stretched into an eternity as they waited. Then the sound of hoofbeats thundered into the yard, followed by a man's voice calling out. "Thornton, we know you're harboring the woman. Send her out and we'll be on our way." Grace felt her blood run cold. They were here for her. But why? Frank's voice came strong and clear in response. "There are no women here but my housekeeper, Rollins. Whatever quarrel you have, it's with me." A harsh laugh followed. "Don't play dumb, Thornton. The woman from the homestead by Elk Creek. She saw my boys moving the cattle 3 nights ago." "She's a witness, and we can't have that," Grace gasped. She hadn't seen anything of the sort. She'd been at the Double T for over a week. "You're mistaken," Frank called back. "And you're trespassing on my land. I suggest you leave while you still can." "We're not leaving without the woman, Thornton. Hand her over or we burn this place to the ground." Esther's grip on her shotgun tightened. "Fools," she muttered. "They're outnumbered and outgunned." Before Grace could respond, the first shots rang out. The battle had begun. What followed was a chaos of gunfire and shouting. Grace and Esther stayed low in the kitchen, away from windows as instructed. Through gaps in the curtains, Grace caught glimpses of men moving, muzzle flashes in the gathering darkness, and at one point, a figure falling from a horse. The gunfight seemed to last forever, though in reality it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. Gradually, the shooting tapered off, replaced by calls between the Double T hands checking on each other. Then Frank's voice. "All clear. They're running." Grace sagged with relief, but her respite was short-lived. The kitchen door burst open and Miguel staggered in, supporting Frank's weight. Blood darkened the right side of Frank's shirt. "He's hit," Miguel said unnecessarily. Grace rushed forward, helping guide Frank to a chair. "How bad?" "Just a graze," Frank insisted through gritted teeth, though his pallor suggested otherwise. Esther was already gathering bandages and her medical supplies. "Let me see," she demanded, pulling away the blood-soaked fabric. The wound was a deep furrow across Frank's ribs, not immediately life-threatening but serious enough to need proper attention. As Esther cleaned and bandaged it, Grace held Frank's hand, her own trembling slightly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "They came for me. This is my fault." Frank's fingers tightened around hers. "This is not your fault," he said firmly. "Rollins was lying. You couldn't have seen anything a week ago because you were already here." His blue eyes held hers intently. "He just wanted an excuse to attack the Double T. We've had bad blood for years." Miguel, hovering nearby, nodded confirmation. "Rollins has been trying to push Mr. Thornton out since he first established the ranch. Says there isn't room for both operations in the valley." This information should have been reassuring, but Grace couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility. "Is anyone else hurt?" "2 of our boys with minor wounds," Miguel reported. "And we think we hit at least 3 of Rollins' men. They took their wounded with them when they fled, but they left blood trails." Frank winced as Esther tightened the bandage. "They won't be back tonight." "But they'll regroup." "Sheriff Miller needs to know about this," Grace said. "Already sent Johnny to town," Miguel confirmed. "Should reach the sheriff by midnight." Esther finished her ministrations and stood, wiping her hands on a cloth. "You need rest," she told Frank sternly. "That wound's deeper than you're admitting." Frank started to protest, but then nodded wearily. "Wake me if there's any sign of them returning." "I'll stay with him," Grace said, her tone brooking no argument. Esther and Miguel exchanged glances but didn't object. Once they had helped Frank to his bedroom in the main house, they withdrew, leaving Grace alone with the injured rancher. The bedroom was simply furnished but comfortable, with a large bed, a dresser, and a small desk in one corner. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that hinted at Frank's wide-ranging interests from cattle breeding to poetry. Grace settled into a chair beside the bed, watching the steady rise and fall of Frank's chest. Despite Esther's insistence that he rest, Frank's eyes remained open, fixed on Grace. "You should get some sleep too," he said softly. Grace shook her head. "I'm not tired." They sat in silence for a few minutes before Frank spoke again. I never told you how I started the double T, did I? Grace leaned forward slightly. No, you didn't. I came west with nothing but a dream and $50 to my name, Frank began, his voice low and measured. Worked as a hired hand on ranches in Nebraska, then Wyoming, saved every penny. When I had enough, I bought my first 50 head of cattle and this land, though it was a lot smaller then. Grace listened, captivated by the story of how Frank had built his ranch from nothing, facing droughts, harsh winters, and hostile neighbors like Rollins. Why are you telling me this now? She asked when he paused. Frank's eyes were intense despite his weakened state. Because I want you to understand something, Grace. Everything worth having in this life comes with risk, with struggle, sometimes with pain. His hand found hers on the bed. But that doesn't mean we stop trying. That we stop living. Grace understood he wasn't just talking about ranching anymore. Frank, I know it's too soon, he continued. I know you're still grieving Thomas in your way, but I need you to know how I feel. His fingers tightened around hers. When I saw you that day, crying over Shadow, something changed for me. I've been alone for so long, convinced that was how it had to be. But then there you were, and suddenly I could see a different future. Grace felt tears gathering in her eyes. I'm afraid, she admitted. Afraid to care that much again, to risk losing someone else. I know, Frank said gently. But is an empty life really safer than a full one with all its risks? The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable in that moment. Eventually, Frank's eyes grew heavy, and he drifted into sleep, his hand still holding hers. Grace remained by his side through the night, watching over him and contemplating the choice before her. Morning brought Sheriff Miller and his deputies, along with the news that 2 of Rollins' men had been captured trying to get treatment for their wounds in a neighboring town. The rest of the gang, including Rollins himself, had apparently fled north as suspected. We'll get them, Sheriff Miller assured Frank, who was sitting up in bed despite Esther's disapproving glare. They can't hide forever. Frank nodded, though he looked skeptical. They've avoided capture this long. Rollins knows every hideout between here and the Canadian border. The sheriff's expression hardened. This time it's different. He attacked a respected rancher in his own home. Even his former friends will turn against him now. After the sheriff departed, promising to post deputies at the ranch until the danger was completely past, Frank turned to Grace. You should eat something, he said. You've been by my side all night. Grace realized she was indeed hungry. I'll bring something back for both of us, she promised, rising from her chair. In the kitchen, she found Esther already preparing breakfast for the hands, who looked tired but vigilant after a night of standing guard. How is he? Esther asked as Grace gathered food onto 2 plates. Better than he should be, considering, Grace replied. Stubborn man. A hint of a smile crossed Esther's stern features. That he is. Been that way since he was a boy. Grace looked at her in surprise. You've known him that long? Esther nodded, her hands continuing to work as she spoke. I was his mother's friend. When she passed, I promised I'd look after him. Followed him west when he got the notion to start ranching. Her sharp eyes fixed on Grace. In all these years, I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Grace felt her cheeks warm. We've only known each other a short time. Time doesn't always matter in these things, Esther said wisely. Some people search their whole lives and never find what you two recognized right away. Before Grace could formulate a response to this unexpected observation, Esther turned back to her stove. Take that food up to him before it gets cold, and tell him I said he's to stay in that bed at least until noon. Grace returned to Frank's room to find him attempting to get dressed. What do you think you're doing? She demanded, setting down the breakfast tray. Frank looked sheepish. I can't lie around all day. The ranch needs its owner alive and well," Grace interrupted. "Miguel has everything under control, and Esther says you're to stay in bed until at least noon." Frank grimaced but settled back against the pillows. "You're as bossy as she is." "Someone has to be," Grace replied, placing a plate on his lap. "Now eat." As they shared breakfast, Grace found herself studying Frank's face, the lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled, the set of his jaw that spoke of determination, the kindness in his blue eyes that had been there from the moment they met. "What?" he asked, noticing her gaze. "I was thinking about what you said last night," Grace admitted. "About empty lives versus full ones." Frank set down his fork, giving her his full attention. "When Thomas died," Grace continued, "I thought that was the end of my chance for happiness. That surviving was the best I could hope for." She took a deep breath. "But these past 2 weeks at the Double T, seeing how you've built not just a ranch but a community, a family of sorts, it's made me reconsider." Hope flickered in Frank's eyes. "What are you saying, Grace?" "I'm saying I'd like to stay," she said simply. "Not just because of the danger from Rollins, but because I want to be here, with you, with all of this." She gestured to encompass the ranch beyond the walls. Frank reached for her hand, his touch gentle despite the strength in his fingers. "Are you sure?" "Your homestead is just land and logs," Grace finished. "Thomas is gone, and holding onto that place won't bring him back. He would want me to live, not just survive." She squeezed Frank's hand. "I'm not promising anything beyond friendship right now. I need time." "Time is something I have plenty of," Frank said, his smile warming her heart. "And friendship is a fine place to start." As summer transitioned to fall, Grace found herself settling into life at the Double T as if she had always belonged there. Her days were full with work alongside Esther, who proved to be a fountain of practical knowledge and dry wit. The older woman's initial reserve gradually gave way to genuine affection as she recognized in Grace a kindred spirit, practical, resilient, and unafraid of hard work. Frank recovered quickly from his wound and resumed his duties around the ranch, though Grace noticed he made more time for conversations with her, often finding reasons to be wherever she was working. They began a tradition of evening walks, exploring the boundaries of the Double T as they talked about everything from books to cattle, breeding to their hopes for the future. News came in early October that the Rollins gang had been captured near the Montana border after attempting to rob a bank in Helena. The sheriff rode out personally to deliver the news, assuring Frank and Grace that Rollins would be spending many years behind bars. "So it's truly over," Grace said that evening as they sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. "It seems so," Frank agreed, "though I'll feel better when the trial is complete." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the rustle of autumn leaves in the breeze. "I rode out to your homestead yesterday," Frank said after a while. Grace looked at him in surprise. "You didn't mention that." "I wanted to make sure everything was secure for the winter," he explained, "and to bring back anything you might need." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her. "Thank you. How did it look?" "Holding up well," Frank reported. "I reinforced a few spots on the roof that looked vulnerable to snow." He hesitated. "I also brought back this." From his pocket, he withdrew a small wooden box. Grace recognized it immediately, the keepsake box Thomas had carved for her during their first year together. In the chaos of her hasty departure, she had forgotten it. "Where did you find it?" she asked, taking the box with trembling fingers. "Under a loose floorboard by the stove," Frank said quietly. "It looked important." Grace opened the box to reveal its contents, her wedding ring, which had grown too loose after the hard winter when food had been scarce. A pressed wildflower from the day Thomas had proposed. and a small daguerreotype of her parents taken before she had defied them to marry Thomas. "Thank you," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "These are all I have left of my former life." Frank nodded, understanding. "I thought you might want them, even if you're building a new life here." Grace closed the box carefully. "The past is part of who we are, even as we move forward." She looked up at him, seeing the uncertainty in his expression. "Finding this doesn't change my decision to stay, Frank." Relief washed over his features. "I'm glad to hear that." As the first snowflakes of winter began to fall in mid-November, life at the Double T settled into its cold weather rhythms. The cattle were brought in closer to the ranch buildings. The last of the harvest was stored, and preparations for the long Wyoming winter were completed. Inside the main house, Esther organized a thorough cleaning, with Grace taking charge of the upstairs rooms. It was while cleaning Frank's study that Grace made a discovery of her own. Tucked inside a volume of Tennyson's poems was a sketch beautifully rendered in pencil of a woman with her hand resting on a horse's neck. With a start, Grace recognized herself and Penny from that first day, when Frank had found her grieving over Shadow. The detail was exquisite, capturing not just her likeness but something of her spirit as well. At the bottom of the page, in a neat hand, Frank had written, "The beginning." Grace was still staring at the drawing when Frank entered the room. He stopped short when he saw what she was holding. "I didn't know you were an artist," Grace said softly. Frank looked embarrassed. "I wouldn't go that far, just something I do to pass the time in winter. It's beautiful." Grace traced the lines of the sketch with her finger. "Is this really how you see me?" Frank crossed the room to stand beside her. "It's how you were that day, strong despite your grief, gentle with Shadow even in death." His voice grew quieter. "Beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with heart." Grace looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. In that moment, she knew with sudden clarity that what had been growing between them over these months was more than friendship, more than gratitude or convenience. "Frank," she began, but he shook his head slightly. "You don't need to say anything, Grace. I promised you time, and I meant it." But Grace had had enough of waiting, enough of holding back out of fear. Setting the sketch carefully on the desk, she closed the distance between them and, with deliberate tenderness, placed her hands on either side of his face. "Time isn't what I need anymore," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "What I need is you." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, a tentative exploration. Then, as if a dam had broken, it deepened into something more urgent, more honest, an acknowledgement of everything that had remained unspoken between them. When they finally parted, Frank rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "Are you sure, Grace? Because I don't think I could bear it if I'm sure," she interrupted, her hand still framing his face. "I've been sure for weeks but was too afraid to admit it." She smiled softly. "You were right about empty lives and full ones. I choose the full one. With you." The joy that spread across Frank's features was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual and then all at once, illuminating everything. "I love you, Grace Zimmerman," he said simply. "Have since that first day, I think." "And I love you, Frank Thornton," she replied, the words feeling like coming home, though it took me a little longer to realize it. As the snow fell more heavily outside, transforming the landscape into a white wilderness, Grace and Frank remained in the study, talking of the future, their future with all its possibilities. There would be challenges ahead, they both knew. Life on the frontier guaranteed that. But facing those challenges together seemed not just manageable but right. Christmas at the Double T that year was a celebration unlike any the ranch had seen before. Esther outdid herself with the cooking. The hands decorated the main house with pine boughs and ribbons, and everyone gathered for a feast that lasted well into the evening. Grace, seated beside Frank at the head of the table, looked around at the faces of these people who had become her family, and felt a contentment she had thought lost forever. After the meal, when the hands had retreated to the bunkhouse with their gifts and Esther had retired to her room, Frank led Grace to the fireplace in the main room. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "Something I've been saving for the right moment." What he withdrew was a simple gold band, unadorned but beautifully crafted. "This was my mother's," Frank explained, his voice solemn. "She made me promise I'd only give it to someone I loved with my whole heart." Grace felt tears gathering as she understood what he was asking. "Frank." He took her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know we haven't known each other long by some standards, but out here, life teaches us not to waste time when something matters." His voice grew softer. "You matter, Grace, more than anything. Are you asking me to marry you, Frank Thornton?" Grace whispered, her heart full. Frank smiled, a touch of his usual confidence returning. "I am, if you'll have me." Grace's answer was to extend her hand, allowing him to slip the ring onto her finger. "Nothing would make me happier." Their wedding took place on New Year's Day, 1878, in the parlor of the Double T main house. The weather had cleared enough for Sheriff Miller to ride out from Wheatland to perform the ceremony, and the entire ranch gathered to witness the union of their boss with the woman who had brought such unexpected joy to their community. Grace wore a dress of deep blue velvet that Esther had secretly ordered from Denver, with a sprig of dried wildflowers in her hair, a nod to her first love, and the journey that had led her to this new beginning. Frank, uncharacteristically nervous, fumbled slightly when placing the ring on her finger but spoke his vows with unwavering certainty. As they sealed their promises with a kiss, cheers erupted from the assembled guests. Outside, the Wyoming winter sunlight sparkled on fresh snow, and in the corral, Penny whinnied as if offering her own approval of the union that might never have happened without her. Later that evening, as they stood on the porch of the main house, now their home together, Frank wrapped his arms around Grace and pointed to the horizon where the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. "What do you see?" he asked quietly. Grace leaned back against him, secure in his embrace. "The future," she replied, "our future." "All because of a dead horse and a mare given freely," Frank mused, pressing a kiss to her temple. Grace turned in his arms to face him. "No," she corrected gently. "All because you saw someone in need and didn't hesitate to help, expecting nothing in return." She touched his face, marveling still at the right to do so. "That's the man I fell in love with." Frank captured her hand and kissed her palm. "And that's the man I'll strive to be every day of our life together." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms while winter wrapped the world in silence, Grace thought of all the twists of fate that had brought them to this moment, the loss that had seemed unbearable, the kindness that had changed everything, and the courage they had both found to embrace a new beginning. Life on the frontier would never be easy. There would be harsh winters and dry summers, cattle that sickened and crops that failed, moments of doubt and days of struggle. But there would also be this love freely given and gratefully received, a partnership of equals facing whatever came their way together. And in the end, Grace knew, that would make all the difference. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it new growth and new beginnings. The Double T flourished under the joint care of Frank and Grace, whose different perspectives complemented each other perfectly. Where he was bold, she was cautious. Where she was innovative, he was traditional. Together, they made decisions that steadily increased both the size and prosperity of the ranch. By summer, news had spread throughout the territory that Frank Thornton was expanding his operation, buying adjacent land from homesteaders who had found the Wyoming climate too challenging. With each acquisition, the Double T grew, as did its reputation for fair dealing and quality stock. But the greatest joy came in early autumn, when Grace discovered she was expecting their first child. "Are you certain?" Frank asked, his expression a mixture of awe and concern when she shared the news. Grace nodded, her hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. Esther confirmed it. "She says I'm about 3 months along." Frank gathered her into his arms with uncharacteristic gentleness. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter months, with Grace maintaining her duties around the ranch, albeit at a slower pace as her condition became more apparent. Esther hovered protectively, insisting Grace rest more and teaching her everything she knew about childbirth and infant care. "My sister was a midwife," Esther explained one snowy afternoon as they sat by the fire, knitting tiny garments. "Taught me everything she knew before she passed. Between the two of us, this baby will arrive just fine." Frank, meanwhile, channeled his nervous energy into preparing a nursery adjacent to their bedroom, crafting a cradle from pine wood, and reading every book on child rearing he could obtain from Denver. "You'd think no one had ever had a baby before," Esther remarked dryly, though her eyes softened whenever she caught Frank speaking softly to Grace's growing belly. As spring blossomed once more across the Wyoming landscape, so did Grace, her body rounding with the new life within. The hands treated her with a mixture of reverence and awkwardness that amused her greatly, particularly Miguel, who insisted on carrying anything heavier than a teacup whenever she appeared. "You'll spoil me," Grace protested one day when he relieved her of a basket of freshly gathered eggs. Miguel grinned, his dark eyes twinkling. "The boss would have my hide if I didn't, Senora Thornton. Besides, we are all waiting for this little one, the first child born at the Double T in all its history." The baby arrived in late May, during a gentle rainfall that brought the scent of fresh grass through the open windows. The labor was long but uncomplicated, with Esther guiding Grace through each stage with calm efficiency. Frank, banished to the hallway after his pacing threatened to drive both women to distraction, wore a path in the floorboards until the first cry of his son echoed through the house. "A boy," Esther announced, opening the door to admit the new father. "Healthy and strong with a good set of lungs." Frank entered the bedroom to find Grace propped against pillows, her face tired but radiant, cradling a small bundle wrapped in soft blankets. "Come meet your son," she said softly. With trembling hands, Frank took the infant, marveling at the perfect tiny features, the wisp of dark hair, the miniature fingers that curled instinctively around his own. "He's miraculous," Frank whispered. "What shall we name him?" Grace asked, watching father and son with love overflowing. Frank considered for a moment. "Thomas," he said finally, looking to Grace for approval. "Thomas Thornton." Tears welled in Grace's eyes at this tribute to her first husband. "Are you sure?" Frank nodded, his gaze steady. "Without him, you wouldn't have come west. Without his loss, as painful as it was, we might never have found each other." He placed their son gently back in her arms. "Besides, it's a strong name for a boy who will grow up on this land." "Thomas Frank Thornton," Grace amended, "after both the men who shaped my life." News of young Thomas's birth spread quickly through the territory, bringing visitors bearing gifts and good wishes. Sheriff Miller rode out with a hand-carved wooden horse, while ranchers from neighboring properties arrived with practical offerings: a fine woolen blanket, a silver cup, promises of calves and colts when the boy was old enough to start his own herd. "Quite a stir your son is causing," Grace observed one evening as she nursed Thomas in the rocking chair Frank had fashioned for her. Frank looked up from the ledger where he was recording the day's business. "People respect what we've built here. The double T represents something important in these parts: stability, prosperity, a future." "Is that what you dreamed of when you started the ranch?" Grace asked curiously. Frank considered the question. "Part of it," he admitted. "I wanted to build something lasting, something that mattered." His gaze moved from Grace to their son and back again. "But I never imagined it would include such happiness." As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the double T continued to thrive. Frank's innovative breeding programs produced cattle better suited to the Wyoming climate, while Grace's management of the household operations freed him to focus on expansion. Together, they were building a legacy that would endure. On Penny's 7th birthday, which Grace insisted on celebrating, much to the amusement of the hands, she took the mare for a ride to the spot where Shadow was buried. Thomas, now almost 3, rode with her, securely held in her arms. "This is where Mama met your papa," she told her curious son as they stood beside the simple marker Frank had placed over Shadow's grave. "This is where our story began." "With the dead horse?" Thomas asked, his small face serious beneath the wide brim of his miniature cowboy hat. Grace smiled, remembering the grief that had seemed so overwhelming that day and the unexpected kindness that had changed everything. "Yes, sweetheart, with the dead horse and the kind cowboy who gave me his best mare without question." As they rode back to the ranch, Thomas chattering excitedly about the hawks circling overhead, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From Boston socialite to frontier widow to wife, mother, and partner in one of the most successful ranches in Wyoming territory, each step had been necessary. Each loss and gain part of the tapestry of her life. When they crested the final hill, and the double T came into view, the expanded main house, the new barn, the growing herd of cattle dotting the lush summer pastures, Grace felt a surge of gratitude, so intense it brought tears to her eyes. "Look, Thomas," she said, pointing to where Frank was visible in the yard talking with Miguel. "There's Papa, waiting for us to come home." As if sensing their presence, Frank looked up, shading his eyes against the sun. When he spotted them, he raised his hand in greeting, his smile visible even at a distance. "Home," Thomas repeated happily, waving enthusiastically at his father. Grace urged Penny forward, her heart full. "Yes," she whispered, "home." In the years that followed, the Thornton family grew with the addition of twin girls, Elizabeth and Margaret, born on a crisp autumn day when Thomas was 5. The double T expanded accordingly, becoming not just a ranch, but the center of a growing community as homesteaders and other ranchers recognized the advantages of settling near such a prosperous operation. Frank, with Grace's encouragement, took on leadership roles in the territory, advocating for fair water rights, improved roads, and eventually, Wyoming statehood. His reputation for integrity and sound judgment made him a respected voice in territorial politics, though he always maintained that his first priority was his family and the ranch. Grace, meanwhile, established a small school on the double T property, initially for her own children but eventually serving neighboring families as well. Her background in education, largely unused since coming west, found new purpose as she shared her love of literature, history, and mathematics with the next generation of Wyoming citizens. Penny lived to the remarkable age of 27, spending her final years in comfortable retirement in the best pasture on the ranch. When she finally passed, It was peacefully, on a warm spring day with Grace by her side, stroking her muzzle and whispering thanks for the role the mare had played in changing her life. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man with his father's height and his mother's compassionate nature. By the age of 18, he was effectively running large portions of the ranch operation, implementing new techniques he'd learned during a year of agricultural study in Denver. The twins, lively and intelligent, showed equal interest in the ranch and the wider world, with Elizabeth developing her father's head for business and Margaret inheriting her mother's love of teaching. On their 25th wedding anniversary, celebrated with a grand party that brought people from as far away as Cheyenne, Frank took Grace aside to a quiet corner of the garden they had painstakingly cultivated over the years. "You ever think about that day?" he asked, his hair now silver at the temples but his blue eyes as bright as ever. "The day we met," Grace nodded, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. "Often, especially when I'm teaching the children about how small moments can change the course of a life." Frank's fingers entwined with hers, the decades of shared work evident in their matching calluses. "I've never told you this, but I nearly didn't ride in that direction that day. I had planned to check the north pasture first, but something intuition perhaps made me change course." "Providence," Grace suggested softly. "Perhaps," Frank agreed. "Or perhaps it was simply that the world occasionally arranges itself to bring the right people together at the right time despite all odds." Grace leaned against him, watching their grown son dance with a pretty girl from town, while their daughters charmed the governor with their intelligent conversation. Around them, the double T hummed with life and purpose, a dream realized beyond anything either of them could have imagined. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Giving Penny to a stranger that day, taking such a chance." Frank's arm tightened around her waist. "Not for a single moment," he said, his voice certain. "Best decision I ever made." As the celebration continued around them, Grace thought of all the threads that had woven together to create this tapestry of a life, grief and joy, loss and discovery, endings and beginnings. From the ashes of her old life, a new one had blossomed, richer and more fulfilling than she could have dreamed during those dark days after Thomas's death. And it had all begun with a moment of pure kindness, a cowboy who had seen a woman crying over her dead horse and had given her his best mare without question, expecting nothing in return, except perhaps the knowledge that he had eased someone's suffering in a harsh and unpredictable world. "I love you, Frank Thornton," Grace said, turning to face the man who had become her partner in all things, today and always. Frank's smile, still capable of making her heart skip after all these years, was tender as he leaned down to kiss her. "And I love you, Grace Thornton. Today, always, and whatever comes after." In the distance, the Wyoming sunset painted the mountains gold and purple, a fitting backdrop to a love story that had begun in grief, but flourished into something enduring and beautiful, a testament to the power of compassion freely given and gratefully received on the wild frontier.